The dusty road stretched endlessly before Grace Norton, as she gripped the wagon reins with trembling hands, her heart hammering against her ribs while two rough-looking men tore through her belongings like wolves through a lamb's pen. It was August 1876, and the California sun beat down mercilessly on San Bernardino's outskirts, where her wagon had been stopped by men claiming to be federal marshals searching for contraband. Their badges looked authentic enough, but something in their cold eyes told Grace this was no official search. "Please, be careful with that," she said, watching one of them dump her mother's china onto the wagon bed without ceremony. The delicate teacups that had traveled all the way from Boston clattered against each other, and she winced at the sound. "Just doing our duty, miss," the taller man said, his voice devoid of sympathy. His partner, a stocky man with a scar across his cheek, was already rifling through the wooden chest where Grace kept her most precious possession. $300 in carefully saved bills, everything she had in this world to start her new life. Grace's breath caught as she watched him pull out the cloth bag. "That's my money. I need that to buy land and supplies." The scarred man exchanged a glance with his partner. "We'll need to confiscate this for evidence." "Evidence of what?" Grace demanded, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "I've done nothing wrong. That money is from selling my family's farm in Missouri. You can't just take it." The tall man stepped closer, and Grace instinctively stepped back. "You calling federal marshals liars, miss?" Before Grace could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "I think the lady's got a point, seeing as how federal marshals don't usually work in pairs without a federal judge's warrant. And last I checked, there hasn't been a federal judge through San Bernardino in 3 months. Grace turned to see a man on horseback approaching from the direction of town. He sat tall in the saddle, wearing a well-worn hat that shaded eyes the color of weathered leather. His clothes were simple, a working cowboy's attire, but he carried himself with quiet confidence that made the two fake marshals shift uncomfortably. "This ain't your business, cowboy," the scarred man growled. The cowboy dismounted with fluid grace, and Grace noticed he kept his hand near the revolver at his hip, though he made no move to draw it. "Elijah Stone," he introduced himself, tipping his hat slightly toward Grace without taking his eyes off the two men. "And I make it my business when I see folks getting robbed on my regular route into town." "We're federal officers," the tall man insisted, but his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. "Then you won't mind riding into town with me to see Sheriff Martinez, will you?" Elijah suggested, his tone pleasant but his stance unyielding. "I'm sure he'd be mighty interested in meeting federal marshals he wasn't notified about." The two men exchanged another glance, and Grace could see the calculation in their eyes. They were weighing their options, and she held her breath, praying they wouldn't choose violence. "Keep your money, lady," the scarred man finally spat, tossing the cloth bag back into the wagon with such force that several bills spilled out. "But you better watch yourself on these roads. Lots of dangerous folks around." The veiled threat hung in the air as the two men mounted their horses and rode off in a cloud of dust. Grace stood frozen, watching them disappear into the heat shimmer on the horizon. It wasn't until they were completely out of sight that she realized she was shaking. "You all right, miss?" Elijah asked, his voice gentler now. Grace turned to look at her rescuer properly for the first time. He was probably in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. His face was honest and open, with the kind of lines around his eyes that came from squinting at distant horizons rather than from age. There was something inherently trustworthy about him that made Grace's racing heart begin to slow. "I think so," she managed, then looked down at her scattered belongings. The wind had caught several of the bills that had spilled from her bag, and she watched in horror as they tumbled across the dusty ground. "Here, let me help," Elijah said, already moving to catch the fleeing currency. Together, they chased down the bills, Grace holding her skirts up as she ran, too focused on recovering her precious savings to worry about propriety. When they had retrieved what they could, Grace counted the money with fingers that still trembled slightly. Her heart sank as she realized the total. "I'm missing nearly $100, she said quietly. "It must have blown away while we were getting the rest, or maybe they pocketed some when I wasn't looking." Elijah's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner." "You saved me from losing everything," Grace said firmly, meeting his eyes. "I'm grateful for that, Mr. Stone." "Elijah, please," he said, then gestured toward her wagon. "Where were you headed when they stopped you? Into San Bernardino?" "I arrived yesterday, but I camped outside town because I wanted to get an early start this morning to look at available properties." Grace began gathering her scattered belongings, trying to restore some order to the chaos the fake marshals had created. "I'm planning to open a bakery. My mother taught me everything she knew, and her honey cakes were famous back in Joplin." "A bakery would do well here," Elijah said, helping her repack the china with far more care than the thieves had shown. His hands were calloused from hard work, but surprisingly gentle. "San Bernardino's growing fast. Lots of miners passing through, ranchers coming to town for supplies, families settling. Folks always need good bread." "That's what I'm hoping," Grace said, carefully wrapping each teacup in cloth before placing it back in its crate. "But the property I was planning to buy costs $250. With what I lost, I'm short now." Elijah was quiet for a moment, and Grace regretted mentioning her financial troubles. She barely knew this man, and here she was, telling him her problems like he was an old friend. Her mother would have scolded her for being too trusting. "There might be other properties," Elijah offered. "I know San Bernardino pretty well. Been working at the Simpson Ranch just outside town for 3 years now. I could help you look around if you'd like. Make sure no one else tries to take advantage of you." Grace considered the offer. Every practical bone in her body told her to be cautious, but something in Elijah Stone's steady gaze made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since her father died 2 years ago. "I'd appreciate that, thank you." They rode into San Bernardino together, Elijah on his horse alongside Grace's wagon. He pointed out landmarks as they went, his voice carrying easily over the creak of wagon wheels and the clip-clop of hooves. He showed her the church with its white steeple, the general store run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, the saloon that he assured her was relatively respectable as such establishments went. "That's the building that used to be a bakery," Elijah said, pointing to a weathered wooden structure on the main street. "Old man Kruger ran it for years, but he passed last winter. His daughter inherited it, but she moved to San Francisco. Been sitting empty since March." Grace studied the building with growing interest. It was smaller than she'd imagined, but the location was excellent, right in the heart of town where foot traffic would be steady. Large windows fronted the street, and she could already envision them displaying fresh pies and cakes. "Do you know who owns it now?" she asked. "Kruger's daughter, far as I know, but there's a land office 2 doors down. Mr. Peterson could tell you more." They stopped at the land office, and Grace climbed down from the wagon with Elijah's assistance. His hand was warm and strong as he helped her, and she was surprised by the little flutter in her stomach at his touch. She pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the practical matter at hand. Mr. Peterson, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, confirmed that the old bakery was indeed for sale. "Miss Kruger is asking $300 for it," he said, pulling out the deed to show Grace. "That includes the building and all the equipment inside. Old Kruger had a fine oven, built it himself from brick and clay. You won't find better in 3 counties." Grace's heart sank. $300. She was 100 short, and that was before considering the cost of supplies, ingredients, and living expenses while she got the business established. She'd been so careful, so frugal, planning every penny. But she hadn't planned for thieves masquerading as lawmen. "Thank you for the information," she said quietly. "I need some time to think about it." Outside, the afternoon sun was at its peak, and Grace felt the weight of disappointment settling over her like a heavy blanket. She'd traveled so far, given up everything familiar, all for a dream that now seemed frustratingly out of reach. "There are other buildings," Elijah said gently. "Not with an oven already built," Grace replied, staring at the bakery. "And not in such a good location. This is perfect. This is exactly what I need." She turned to him with a rueful smile. "I'm sorry. You've been nothing but kind, and here I am complaining. You must have work to get back to." "Actually, it's my day off," Elijah said. "I was coming into town for supplies when I saw those men bothering you." "The supplies can wait. Have you eaten?" "There's a decent restaurant near the hotel." Grace realized she was hungry. She'd been too nervous that morning to eat much breakfast, and the encounter with the thieves had driven all thought of food from her mind. "I shouldn't impose on you any further." "It's not an imposition if I'm offering," Elijah said, and there was something in his smile that made Grace's heart do that strange flutter again. "Besides, you can tell me more about these famous honey cakes. I've got a powerful sweet tooth." Over lunch at a small restaurant with red checkered tablecloths, Grace found herself relaxing for the first time since she'd left Missouri. Elijah was easy to talk to, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. She told him about growing up in Joplin, helping her mother in the kitchen from the time she was old enough to hold a wooden spoon. She talked about how her father had died in a farming accident, how her mother had passed just 8 months later, leaving Grace alone in a town full of memories. "My uncle wanted me to come live with him in St. Louis," Grace explained, absently breaking apart a piece of cornbread. "He's a good man, but his wife made it clear I'd be little more than an unpaid servant, helping with their 6 children. I wanted something of my own, something I could build with my own 2 hands." "That takes courage," Elijah said. "Coming all this way alone. Or foolishness," Grace said with a slight smile. "I'm not sure which yet." "Courage," Elijah said firmly. "I came west when I was 18, didn't know a soul. My father wanted me to take over his store in Philadelphia, but I couldn't see myself spending my life indoors, measuring out flour and sugar for other people. I wanted open spaces, wanted to work with horses and cattle, wanted to see mountains and deserts." He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "Probably sounds childish." "It sounds honest," Grace said. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Elijah considered the question. "Mostly. The work is hard, but I like it. I like working for the Simpsons. They're fair people, treat their hands well. I've saved up a good bit over the years, planning to buy my own spread someday. Nothing fancy, just enough land for a small herd and a decent house." They talked through lunch and into the afternoon, and Grace was surprised by how comfortable she felt with this man she'd known for only a few hours. He told her about life on the ranch, about the cattle drives and the roundups, about learning to rope and ride from an old cowboy named Pete who'd worked cattle since before California was even a state. Grace found herself laughing at his stories, the tension of the morning finally melting away. When they finished eating, Elijah insisted on showing her around town more thoroughly. They walked down the main street, and he introduced her to shopkeepers and business owners. Mrs. Chen at the general store was a tiny Chinese woman with a shrewd eye and a warm smile. She'd come to California during the gold rush with her husband, who died in the mines, and she'd built her store from nothing. "You want to start a bakery?" Mrs. Chen said, her eyes lighting up. "Good, good. I sell flour, sugar, all the things you need. I give you fair prices, better than you get anywhere else." They met Sheriff Martinez, a middle-aged Mexican man with a mustache and a calm, authoritative presence. When Elijah mentioned the fake marshals, the sheriff's expression darkened. "There have been reports," he said. "Two men working this stretch of road claiming official business to rob travelers. Can you describe them?" Grace did her best, and the sheriff took notes. "We'll keep an eye out. You did right, Elijah, running them off. But Miss Norton, you should file a proper report." After giving her statement to the sheriff, Grace felt drained. The day's events were catching up with her, and though it was only late afternoon, she wanted nothing more than to find a quiet room and think about her next move. "I should find a place to stay," she said to Elijah. "Thank you for everything you've done. You've been incredibly kind to a stranger." "The hotel's decent," Elijah said, pointing to a two-story building with a painted sign. "Mrs. O'Malley runs it. She's particular about her guests, which means it's respectable and clean." He helped her arrange for a room and for her wagon to be stored in the hotel's stable. As Grace prepared to say goodbye, Elijah hesitated, looking like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. "I know it's not my place," he finally said, "but would you mind if I called on you tomorrow? I have some ideas about the bakery situation that I'd like to discuss." Grace was curious despite herself. "What kind of ideas?" "Let me work them out first," Elijah said, "but I think there might be a solution to your problem. Will you meet me for breakfast?" 8 o'clock. Grace agreed, and after Elijah left, she climbed the stairs to her room, her mind spinning. She counted her money again, hoping she'd somehow miscalculated earlier, but the total remained stubbornly the same: $206. Not enough for the bakery, and if she spent too much on hotel rooms and meals, she'd have even less. That night, Grace lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town settling in for the night. She thought about Elijah Stone and his easy kindness, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle strength in his hands. She barely knew him, yet he'd spent his entire day off helping her, asking nothing in return. It was the kind of goodness her mother had always said was rare in this world. Morning came with bright sunshine streaming through her window. Grace dressed carefully in her best day dress, a practical blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and braided her honey-colored hair into a neat coronet. She told herself she wasn't trying to look nice for Elijah, but the extra time she spent pinning her hair suggested otherwise. Elijah was waiting in the hotel dining room, already seated at a table by the window. He stood when he saw her, and Grace noticed he'd cleaned up too, wearing what looked like his best shirt and with his hair freshly combed. The thought that he might have made an effort for her made her pulse quicken. "Good morning," he said, pulling out her chair. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," Grace replied, which was a polite lie. She tossed and turned for hours, her mind unable to settle. "You said you had ideas about the bakery." Elijah waited until they'd ordered breakfast before speaking. He seemed nervous, his fingers drumming lightly on the table edge. "I did a lot of thinking last night," he began. "About your situation and about what you're trying to build here. That bakery is perfect for what you need, and it's a shame to let it slip away over $100. $94 to be precise," Grace said with a rueful smile. "But I don't see what can be done about it. I could try to negotiate with Miss Kruger, but Mr. Peterson said she's firm on the price." "What if you had the full 300? Elijah asked quietly. Grace set down her coffee cup, confused. "But I don't. Unless you know of a bank that would loan money to a woman with no collateral and no established business history, which I very much doubt. Elijah reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He set it on the table between them with a soft clink of coins. "There's $100 in there. It's yours if you want it." Grace stared at the pouch like it was a snake. "I don't understand." "I've been saving for years," Elijah explained. "I've got close to $400 put away. I can spare $100 to help you buy the bakery." "Absolutely not," Grace said immediately, pushing the pouch back toward him. "I can't take your money, Elijah. That's your future, your dream of owning land." "I'll still have $300 left," he pointed out. "Plenty to buy land when the right opportunity comes along. And honestly, Grace, helping you feels like the right thing to do. Those men stole from you. It's not fair that you should lose your dream because of thieves." Grace felt tears prickling at her eyes, overwhelmed by the gesture. "You barely know me. Why would you do this?" Elijah was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "Because in the short time I've known you, I've seen someone brave enough to travel halfway across the country alone, someone with dreams and the courage to chase them. I've seen someone kind and honest and determined. Maybe I don't know you well yet, but I'd like to, and I'd like to help you succeed." The breakfast arrived, but Grace barely noticed. She was looking at Elijah, really looking at him, seeing past the helpful stranger to the good man beneath. A man who would give his hard-earned savings to someone he'd just met, asking nothing in return. "I can't accept this as a gift," Grace said finally. "But what if it was a loan? I could pay you back once the bakery starts making a profit." Elijah looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Grace's expression must have told him she wouldn't budge on this point. "All right," he agreed. "A loan, then. No interest, and you pay me back when you can, not before you're on solid footing." "A proper loan has interest," Grace insisted. 5%, and I'll draw up a contract. We'll both sign it, make it official." They negotiated the terms over eggs and bacon, Grace's business sense warring with her overwhelming gratitude. Finally, they settled on terms they both could accept. 5% interest, payable when the bakery showed a profit, with no set timeline for repayment. "We should go to Mr. Peterson's office as soon as it opens," Grace said, her heart racing with excitement and nerves. "Before I lose my courage." "You're the bravest person I've met in a long time," Elijah said. "I don't think you could lose your courage if you tried." At 9 o'clock, they stood in the land office while Mr. Peterson drew up the papers. Grace counted out $300 with shaking hands, adding Elijah's 100 to her own 206. The remaining $6 would have to stretch for food and supplies until she could get the bakery running. "Congratulations, Miss Norton," Mr. Peterson said, handing her the deed. "You're now the proud owner of Kruger's Bakery." Grace stared at the deed, her name written in careful script on the official document. Grace Norton, proprietor. It felt real and surreal all at once. She owned a building, a business. She had a chance to make her dreams reality. Outside, holding the deed like it was made of spun glass, Grace turned to Elijah with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "Just promise me you'll make those famous honey cakes sometime soon." Grace laughed through her tears. "You'll be the first customer, I promise." They walked to the bakery together, and Mr. Peterson met them there with the keys. The door creaked as Grace pushed it open, and the smell of old flour and yeast greeted her, familiar and welcoming. The front room was dusty but spacious, with a long counter and shelves where she could display her goods. Behind that was the kitchen, and Grace gasped when she saw the oven Elijah had mentioned. It was a work of art, built from red brick and clay with a large firebox and a baking chamber that could hold a dozen loaves at once. Mr. Kruger had clearly been a craftsman as well as a baker. There were wooden work tables, mixing bowls, bread pans, and all the tools of the trade, dusty but serviceable. "It's perfect," Grace whispered, running her hand along the smooth wood of the counter. "It's absolutely perfect." Elijah grinned at her enthusiasm. "Want some help cleaning it up?" "You've done so much already," Grace protested weakly, but she was already hoping he'd insist. "I'm not doing anything else today," Elijah said. "Might as well make myself useful." They spent the day cleaning, sweeping out months of accumulated dust, washing windows until they sparkled, scrubbing the floors and work surfaces. Mrs. Chen sent over cleaning supplies and refused payment, saying it was a welcoming gift for a new neighbor. Other townspeople stopped by to introduce themselves, curious about the woman who was reopening the bakery. As they worked, Grace and Elijah talked, the conversation flowing as easily as it had the day before. He told her about his childhood in Philadelphia, about his mother who died when he was young and his stern but fair father. She told him about learning to bake beside her mother, about the satisfaction of creating something with her own hands that brought people joy. "Food is more than just sustenance," Grace said, carefully washing the old mixing bowls. "It's comfort, it's celebration, it's memory. Every time someone bites into a piece of fresh bread or a sweet cake, they're connecting to something fundamental. My mother used to say that baking was like sharing a little bit of home with everyone who walked through the door." "My mother used to bake," Elijah said quietly. "I don't remember much about her, but I remember the smell of her bread. Sometimes I catch that scent and I'm 5 years old again, sitting at the kitchen table watching her work." By evening, the bakery looked transformed. It still needed work, needed fresh paint and repairs, but it was clean and welcoming. Grace stood in the doorway as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and felt a fierce sense of pride. This was hers. This was the beginning of everything she'd dreamed about. "I should get back to the ranch," Elijah said reluctantly. "But I'll come by tomorrow if you'd like. I'm good with carpentry, could fix that wobbling shelf and patch the loose board in the floor." "You're supposed to be working," Grace reminded him. "I can't keep monopolizing all your free time." "You let me worry about my time," Elijah said with a smile. "Besides, I told you, I want to be your first customer. I've got a vested interest in seeing this place succeed." Over the following days, a pattern developed. Elijah would come to town in the evenings after finishing his work at the ranch, and he'd help Grace prepare the bakery for opening. He fixed the shelf and the floor, repaired a broken window pane, and built a new display case for the front counter. His hands were skilled and sure, and Grace found herself watching him work, admiring the way he approached each task with patience and care. They talked while they worked, sharing stories and dreams, learning each other's histories and hopes. Grace learned that Elijah had a younger sister back in Philadelphia, married now with 2 children he'd never met. He sent money when he could, and received letters telling him about his niece and nephew growing up without knowing their uncle. "Do you miss them?" Grace asked one evening as they painted the front room a warm cream color. "Sometimes," Elijah admitted, "but I don't regret coming west. This feels like where I'm meant to be." He glanced at her, and there was something in his eyes that made Grace's breath catch. "More and more lately, it feels right being here." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned her attention back to painting, but she couldn't stop the smile that played at her lips. She was growing fond of Elijah Stone, dangerously fond. She looked forward to his visits with an eagerness that had nothing to do with the help he provided. She noticed small things about him: the way he hummed while he worked, the the gentle way he spoke to the stray cat that had started hanging around the bakery, the consideration he showed in everything he did. After 2 weeks of preparation, the bakery was ready. Grace had spent the last of her money on ingredients from Mrs. Chen, buying flour and sugar, butter and eggs, honey and spices. She'd spent 3 days baking, testing the oven's temperament, relearning the adjustments needed for a new heat source. The results had been imperfect at first, but gradually she'd found her rhythm. Now, the night before opening day, she stood in the kitchen preparing for the morning rush she hoped would come. Elijah was there too, having taken the day off from the ranch. He'd been invaluable, stoking the fire, fetching supplies, washing dishes as she used them. "You should go home and rest," Grace said, rolling out dough for the morning's bread. "Tomorrow's a big day." "I want to see you through this," Elijah replied, feeding another log into the oven's firebox. "I've invested too much to miss the grand opening." "You've invested your savings," Grace said quietly, "which still amazes me. I don't think I've ever met anyone as generous as you, Elijah Stone." He looked up from the fire, his face serious in the flickering light. "It's not generosity, Grace. It's selfishness disguised as kindness." "How do you figure that?" Elijah stood, brushing ash from his hands. "Because I gave you that money partly hoping it would give me a reason to stay close to you. I wanted an excuse to see you every day, to be part of what you're building here." "If that's not selfish, I don't know what is." Grace's heart was pounding. "And why would you want to stay close to me?" "I think you know why," Elijah said softly. He crossed the kitchen to stand before her, and Grace set down her rolling pin with shaking hands. "From the moment I saw you standing up to those thieves, something in my chest just knew. I've been trying to ignore it, telling myself it's too soon, that you've got enough to deal with without a cowboy complicating your life. But Grace, I can't seem to stop thinking about you." "I think about you too," Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I should, more than is probably wise." "Is it wise?" Elijah asked. "I don't know, but it feels right. You feel right." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, but Grace didn't move. His hand cupped her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing across her skin with infinite tenderness. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. "I'm scared," she confessed. "I barely know how to run a business, and I'm frightened I'll fail. And now there's this, whatever this is between us, and I'm scared of that too. Scared that I'm feeling too much too fast." "I'm scared too," Elijah said, "but being scared doesn't make it any less real." He leaned down, and Grace rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was soft and sweet, tentative and exploratory, like the first taste of something delicious. When they parted, Grace was breathless, her hand resting over her racing heart. "I should finish the bread," she said weakly. "You should," Elijah agreed, but neither of them moved. They kissed again, longer this time, and Grace felt something unlock in her chest, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the heat from the oven. This was what people wrote songs about, what poets tried to capture in verse. This feeling of rightness, of coming home to a place you'd never been before. Finally, they returned to work, but everything felt different now. The air between them was charged with possibility, with promise. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing glances that made Grace's stomach flutter. When the bread was finally rising and the pies were cooling on the shelf, Elijah reluctantly prepared to leave. "I'll be here first thing in the morning," he promised. "Before the doors open." "You don't have to," Grace said. "You've already done so much." "I want to be here," Elijah said firmly. "I want to see the look on people's faces when they taste your baking. I want to see your dream come true." He kissed her goodnight at the bakery door, a sweet, lingering kiss that left Grace dizzy. She watched him ride away into the darkness, then turned to survey her kingdom. Tomorrow would tell if she'd made the right choice coming to San Bernardino, if her mother's recipes would find a home in this frontier town. Grace was up before dawn, stoking the fire and pulling the risen bread from its proving cloth. She shaped the loaves with practiced hands, scoring the tops with a sharp knife before sliding them into the hot oven. The honey cakes came next, her mother's special recipe that required precise timing and temperature. While those baked, she made cinnamon rolls, glazing them with a mixture of sugar and cream. Elijah arrived just as the sun was painting the eastern sky pink. He brought coffee and 2 fried egg sandwiches from the restaurant. "You need to eat," he said firmly when Grace protested that she wasn't hungry. "Can't run a bakery if you faint from hunger." They ate quickly, and Elijah helped Grace arrange the display case. The bread came out perfect, golden crusted and fragrant. The honey cakes were light and sweet, the cinnamon rolls sticky and perfect. Grace made a batch of butter cookies and a dried apple pie, using the last of her ingredients. At 7 o'clock, she unlocked the door and turned the sign to open. Then she stood behind the counter, her heart in her throat, and waited. For the first hour, no one came. Grace tried not to panic, tried not to see this as an omen of failure. Elijah sat at one of the small tables she'd set up, pretending to read a newspaper but really watching her with concern. At 8 o'clock the door opened. Mrs. Chen bustled in, her face breaking into a smile when she saw the display. "I tell all my customers about you," she announced. "They come, you wait, but first I buy." She purchased a loaf of bread and 2 honey cakes, insisting on paying full price even when Grace tried to offer a discount. After Mrs. Chen came a trickle of curious townspeople. A mother with 3 children who bought cookies, a merchant who purchased 2 loaves of bread, a rancher who took the entire tray of cinnamon rolls, saying they reminded him of what his own mother used to make. By noon, Grace had sold more than half her inventory. By 3 o'clock, only a few items remained. Elijah had long since given up his pretense of reading, openly beaming with pride as customer after customer praised Grace's baking. The last customer of the day was an elderly woman who examined the remaining honey cake with shrewd eyes. "Kruger was a good baker," she said. "But his cakes were always too dense, too much flour, not enough care." She took a bite of Grace's cake and her expression softened. "This is how cake should taste, light as air, sweet as sunshine. You've got a gift, young lady." After the woman left, Grace locked the door and leaned against it, exhausted and exhilarated. "We did it," she said to Elijah. "The first day, and we sold almost everything." "You did it," Elijah corrected, crossing to pull her into his arms. "This is all you, Grace. Your talent, your hard work, your dream." Grace rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I couldn't have done it without you. The money, the help, the support. You made this possible." "We make a good team," Elijah said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They did make a good team, Grace thought as she counted the day's earnings. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to buy more supplies and still have a little left over. If every day went like this, she could build something real here, something lasting. The weeks that followed established a rhythm. Grace would wake before dawn to start baking, and the bakery would open at 7. Elijah came every evening after work, helping her clean and prepare for the next day. On Sundays, when the bakery was closed, they would spend the day together, taking walks around San Bernardino, riding out to see the surrounding countryside, or simply sitting in the bakery talking while Grace tested new recipes. Grace's business grew steadily. Word spread about the quality of her baking, and soon she had regular customers who came daily for fresh bread. She started taking special orders for birthday cakes and pies, adding to her income. Mrs. O'Malley from the hotel approached her about supplying bread and pastries for the hotel dining room, which became a reliable source of steady income. As the bakery flourished, so did Grace's relationship with Elijah. They fell into courtship with the easy comfort of old friends and the excitement of new love. Elijah was patient and respectful, never pushing for more than Grace was ready to give, but his feelings were clear in every look, every touch, every moment they spent together. 3 months after the bakery opened, on a cool November evening, Elijah helped Grace close up shop. They developed a routine. Grace would clean the kitchen while Elijah swept the front and counted the till. Then they'd sit together at one of the small tables, sharing whatever treats hadn't sold that day and talking about their days. "I paid Mrs. Chen today for this month's supplies," Grace said, pulling a small ledger from beneath the counter. "And I've set aside $20. "Saving for something special?" Elijah asked. "Paying back my debt," Grace replied, sliding an envelope across the table. "That's $20 toward what I owe you plus $1 in interest." Elijah looked at the envelope like it might bite him. "Grace, we talked about this. You don't need to pay me back until the business is really established." "The business is established," Grace said firmly. "I'm making a profit. Not a huge one, but enough to live on and start repaying what you loaned me. I insist, Elijah. This is important to me." Reluctantly, Elijah took the envelope. "You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met." "I prefer to think of it as being determined," Grace said with a smile. "Besides, you loaned money to a businesswoman. Did you really think I wouldn't approach repayment in a businesslike manner?" "I suppose I hoped you'd see it as a gift," Elijah admitted. "It was a gift," Grace said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "The most generous gift anyone has ever given me. But it was also a loan, and I'm going to repay every penny. It's a matter of pride." "I know," Elijah said, squeezing her hand. "It's one of the things I love about you." The words hung in the air between them. Love. Neither of them had said it before, though the feeling had been growing for months, as obvious as the sunrise but unspoken until now. "You love me?" Grace asked quietly. Elijah met her eyes steadily. "I do. I've loved you since the day I watched you chase down those bills in the wind, so determined not to lose a single dollar. I've loved you watching you build this business from nothing, watching you win over this whole town with your kindness and your honey cakes. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you hum while you knead bread. I love everything about you, Grace Norton." Tears pricked Grace's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been so afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon, afraid you didn't feel the same way." Elijah came around the table and pulled her to her feet, cupping her face in his hands. "How could I not feel the same way? You're the most remarkable woman I've ever known." He kissed her and Grace melted into his embrace, all the fear and doubt washing away. This was right. This was real. This was the kind of love that lasted. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Grace." Grace's heart skipped. "What?" "Marry me," Elijah repeated. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few months, but I'm sure. I've never been more sure of anything. I love you and I want to spend my life with you. Say yes." Grace thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The loss of her parents, the long journey west, the theft that had nearly derailed her dreams, and Elijah's kindness that had saved them. She thought about these past months working beside him, learning him, growing to depend on his steady presence and gentle strength. She thought about the future she wanted, and in every vision, Elijah was there. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." Elijah whooped and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around the bakery while Grace shrieked with laughter. When he set her down, they were both grinning like fools, and Grace felt happier than she'd ever thought possible. "I don't have a ring yet," Elijah said. "I'll get you one, a proper one, as soon as I can." "I don't need a ring," Grace said. "I just need you." But Elijah insisted, and 2 days later he presented her with a simple gold band set with a small garnet. It wasn't fancy, but it was beautiful, and Grace cried when he slipped it onto her finger. They were married 3 weeks later in the little church with the white steeple. Mrs. Chen closed her store to attend, and Mrs. O'Malley from the hotel insisted on hosting the wedding breakfast. The Simpsons came, the ranch owners Elijah worked for, along with half their crew. Sheriff Martinez was there, and Mr. Peterson from the land office, and what felt like half the town. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and carried all the way from Missouri. It needed taking in at the waist, but Mrs. O'Malley had a deft hand with alterations. Standing at the altar, looking into Elijah's eyes as they spoke their vows, Grace felt her mother's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. "I, Grace, take you, Elijah, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." Elijah's vows were equally simple and profound, his deep voice carrying through the small church. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Elijah kissed her with such tenderness that Grace felt tears streaming down her face. The wedding breakfast was a joyous affair, with food and laughter and dancing. Grace had baked a 3-tiered cake covered in honey buttercream, and everyone declared it the finest wedding cake they'd ever tasted. As the afternoon wore on, and the celebration showed no signs of slowing, Elijah pulled Grace aside. "Should we slip away?" he asked quietly. "I want to get you alone, Mrs. Stone." Grace flushed at the name. Mrs. Stone. She was a married woman now, starting a new chapter. "Where will we go? I haven't even thought about where we'll live." "I've got a surprise for you," Elijah said, his eyes twinkling. "Come on." They made their excuses and left the celebration, riding together on Elijah's horse out of town. Grace sat in front of him in the saddle, his arms around her as he guided the horse. After about 20 minutes, they turned off the main road onto a smaller track. "Where are we going?" Grace asked. "You'll see," Elijah said mysteriously. They rode up a gentle hill, and at the top, Elijah reined in the horse. Grace gasped. Spread before them was a small valley, green and lush, with a creek running through it. And nestled beside the creek was a small house, newly built from fresh lumber. "What is this?" Grace breathed. "Our home," Elijah said. "If you like it. I bought this land 3 years ago, been saving for it since I first came to California. I built the house these past 2 months, working every spare moment. It's not much yet, just 3 rooms, but it's solid and it's ours." Grace was speechless. She'd assumed they'd live in the small apartment above the bakery, cramped but functional. She'd never imagined this, a real house, land of their own. Elijah helped her down from the horse and led her inside. The house smelled of fresh wood and new beginnings. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a bedroom with a real bed frame that Elijah had clearly built himself, and a kitchen with a window overlooking the valley. "I know it's far from the bakery," Elijah said, suddenly nervous. "About a half-hour ride. But I thought maybe on Sundays or when you have help at the bakery you could come home, and eventually maybe we could expand, add rooms for." He trailed off, looking embarrassed. "For children," Grace finished softly. "You're thinking about our future." "I'm always thinking about our future," Elijah said. "Every day since I met you, I've been thinking about all the years ahead, all the things we'll do together." Is that too much? Grace threw her arms around his neck. It's perfect. You're perfect. This house is perfect. I can't believe you did all this. I wanted to give you something, Elijah said, holding her close. You've worked so hard for everything you have. I wanted to give you a home, a place that's just ours. That night, alone in their new house, Grace and Elijah began their married life together. They made love slowly and sweetly, learning each other with patient tenderness. Afterward, lying in Elijah's arms with moonlight streaming through the window, Grace felt a contentment so deep it almost frightened her. I never imagined I could be this happy, she confessed. After my parents died, I thought that kind of joy was behind me. But this, it's more than I ever dreamed. We're going to have a good life, Elijah promised, stroking her hair. I'm going to spend every day making sure you know how loved you are. The following months proved him right. They settled into married life with surprising ease, two independent people learning to be a partnership. Grace continued running the bakery, rising before dawn to bake while Elijah worked at the Simpson Ranch. In the evenings, they'd meet at the bakery, and Elijah would help her close before they rode home together. The arrangement worked well, though the early mornings were hard. Grace would slip from bed in the darkness, careful not to wake Elijah, and ride into town alone. It was peaceful, those quiet hours before sunrise, and she came to cherish the solitude of her morning bakes. Winter brought challenges. The roads sometimes became impassable with mud, forcing Grace to sleep at the bakery for days at a time. She hated being apart from Elijah, even for a few nights, and she could see the same loneliness in his eyes when they were finally reunited. Maybe we should think about moving closer to town, Elijah suggested one particularly muddy March evening when Grace had finally made it home after 4 days away. I love this house, Grace protested. I love waking up to the view of the valley, love the peace and quiet. I do too, Elijah said, but I hate being away from you. Maybe we could keep the house for weekends and find a small place in town for during the week. They compromised by arranging for Grace to hire help at the bakery. Mrs. Chen recommended her niece, May, a quiet girl of 19 who was quick to learn and had a natural talent for pastry. With May's help, Grace could occasionally take a morning off, and the weekends became truly restful. As spring turned to summer, Grace began to notice changes in her body. She was tired more than usual, and certain smells that had never bothered her before suddenly made her nauseous. When she missed her monthly courses for the second time, she went to see Dr. Harrison, an older gentleman who'd been San Bernardino's only doctor for 15 years. "Congratulations, Mrs. Stone," he said with a kind smile. "You're going to have a baby. I'd say you're about 3 months along, due sometime in late October or early November." Grace left the doctor's office in a daze. A baby. She was going to be a mother. The thought filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had no mother to guide her, no female relatives to ask for advice. What if she was terrible at this? What if something went wrong? She didn't tell Elijah right away. She wanted to be sure, wanted to get past the fear to the joy beneath. That evening, after they'd finished dinner and were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Grace finally found her courage. "Elijah, I have something to tell you." He turned to her, immediately concerned. "What's wrong? You've been quiet all evening." "Nothing's wrong," Grace assured him. "At least I don't think so. I hope not. Oh, I'm making a mess of this." She took a deep breath. "I'm going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby. In November." Elijah stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, growing wider and wider until he was grinning like a madman. "A baby, truly, truly," Grace confirmed. And suddenly Elijah was kissing her, laughing and crying at the same time. "We're going to have a baby," he kept repeating like he couldn't quite believe it. "Grace, this is wonderful. This is the best news. Are you happy?" "You're happy, right?" "I'm terrified," Grace admitted. "But yes, I'm happy. So happy I can barely breathe." They spent the evening making plans, talking about names and futures and all the things they'd teach their child. Elijah's hand kept drifting to Grace's still flat stomach, his expression full of wonder. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Grace found the summer heat increasingly difficult to bear. She reduced her hours at the bakery, letting May take on more responsibility. The girl proved capable, and Grace began training her to handle the business independently. "You'll need someone reliable when the baby comes," Mrs. Chen said approvingly. "May is good worker. She learned fast like you." As Grace's belly swelled, Elijah became increasingly protective. He insisted on riding with her to town every morning, wouldn't let her lift anything heavy, and fretted constantly about her health. Grace found it both touching and slightly frustrating. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she told him when he tried to stop her from kneading bread. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm not going to break." "I know," Elijah said sheepishly. "I just can't help worrying. You're everything to me, Grace. You and this baby, you're my whole world." Grace softened, taking his hand and placing it on her rounded stomach. "We're fine, feel that. That's our child, healthy and strong, kicking up a storm." Elijah's face lit up as he felt the baby move. "That's amazing. That's our baby in there." "Our baby," Grace agreed, covering his hand with hers. On a cold November night, 3 days before Thanksgiving, Grace's water broke. She woke Elijah in a panic, and he rode into town at a breakneck pace to fetch Dr. Harrison and Mrs. O'Malley, who'd offered to help with the birth. The labor was long and difficult. Grace had known childbirth would be painful, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. Wave after wave of agony crashed over her, and there were moments when she was certain she couldn't endure another second. But Elijah was there through it all, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, whispering encouragements. "You're so strong," he kept saying. "You're the strongest person I know. You can do this, Grace. You can do this." Finally, after 18 hours of labor, their son was born. The moment Dr. Harrison placed the squalling infant in her arms, all the pain vanished, replaced by overwhelming love. Grace stared down at the tiny red face, the flailing fists, the shock of dark hair, and felt her heart crack open. "He's perfect," she whispered. "He's beautiful," Elijah agreed, his voice thick with tears. "Just like his mother." They named him Edward James Stone after Elijah's father and Grace's. Little Eddie, as they quickly began calling him, was a healthy, hungry baby with a powerful set of lungs. The first weeks were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and constant feedings, but Grace had never been happier. Watching Elijah with their son melted her heart in new ways every day. He was so gentle, so patient, singing to Eddie in his deep voice, walking him around the house at 3 in the morning when the baby wouldn't settle. This was the man who'd given her his savings when she was a stranger, who'd helped her build her dream, who'd loved her with unwavering devotion. And now he was the father of her child, teaching their son about goodness through his every action. Grace reduced her hours at the bakery even further, working only 3 days a week while May managed the rest. It was hard giving up control, but Grace found she didn't mind as much as she'd expected. Her priorities had shifted. The bakery was still important, but it was no longer everything. Her family was everything now. Winter passed into spring, and Eddie grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, happy baby. He had Grace's honey-colored hair and Elijah's brown eyes, and he smiled constantly, as if the whole world delighted him. Grace and Elijah doted on him shamelessly, marveling at every milestone. "He's going to be spoiled rotten, Mrs." Chen said, watching Elijah bounce Eddie on his knee while the baby shrieked with laughter. Probably, Grace agreed, completely unrepentant on a warm May evening when Eddie was 6 months old. Grace was going through the bakery's account books. Business had remained steady even with her reduced hours, and she'd been faithfully paying Elijah $20 a month toward her debt. "Elijah," she called to where he was playing with Eddie on a blanket in the corner. "Come look at this." He brought Eddie with him, settling the baby on his hip as he leaned over the ledger. "What am I looking at?" "This," Grace said, pointing to a number at the bottom of the page. "I've paid you back. The full $100 plus interest. The debt is settled." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "That was fast. It's only been a little over a year." "The bakery's been doing well," Grace said, "and it's important to me that this be settled. You gave me everything, Elijah. The least I could do was pay you back as promised." "You've given me everything too," Elijah said softly. "A home, a family, a purpose beyond just working and saving. You've given me love, Grace. That's worth more than all the money in the world." Eddie chose that moment to grab his father's nose, making them both laugh. Grace reached over to ruffle her son's hair, her heart full to bursting. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "For that day on the road when you stopped those men from robbing me. If you hadn't come along when you did, I don't know what would have happened." "I think you would have been fine," Elijah said. "You're resourceful, you would have figured something out." "But I'm glad I was there. I'm glad those thieves brought us together, even if their methods were questionable." "Everything happens for a reason," Grace mused. "My parents dying, as awful as that was, brought me west. The thieves stealing my money brought you into my life. All the hard things led to this moment, to us, to Eddie. I wouldn't change any of it." "Neither would I," Elijah agreed. That summer, Sheriff Martinez finally caught the two men who'd robbed Grace. They'd been working the roads between San Bernardino and Los Angeles for over a year, posing as various officials to fleece travelers. They were tried and sentenced to 5 years in prison. "Justice served," the sheriff said when he came to tell Grace. "Though I doubt you'll get your money back. They spent it all from what we can tell." "I don't need it back," Grace said, watching Eddie play with his toy blocks on the floor. "Everything worked out the way it was supposed to. The years that followed were good ones." The bakery continued to thrive under Grace's and May's joint management, becoming a beloved fixture of San Bernardino. Grace eventually made May a full partner, splitting the profits equally. It was the right decision, allowing Grace to focus more on her growing family while ensuring the business stayed strong. 2 years after Eddie was born, Grace had twin girls, Lily and Rose, identical down to the dimples in their cheeks. Elijah joked that they'd gone from 1 child to 3 overnight, and the house suddenly seemed much smaller. They added on 2 more rooms, Elijah doing most of the work himself with help from the Simpson Ranch hands. Another 2 years brought a second son, Thomas, a quiet, thoughtful baby who seemed content to watch the world rather than demand its attention. Grace sometimes felt overwhelmed by the chaos of 4 children under 5, but Elijah was an equal partner in parenting, changing diapers and soothing tears without complaint. "My father never did any of this," he told Grace one night after getting Thomas back to sleep. "He loved us, but he thought child rearing was women's work. But I don't want to miss a moment of our children growing up. These years are precious." Grace loved him more every day if that was possible. He was exactly the kind of father she'd hoped he'd be, patient and playful, firm but loving. Their children adored him, and Eddie in particular worshipped his father, following him around constantly, wanting to help with everything. When Eddie was 7, Elijah began teaching him about ranch work, taking him along on Saturdays. The boy took to it naturally, showing his father's same ease with horses and cattle. The twins were different, more interested in helping Grace at the bakery, standing on stools to help mix dough and decorate cookies. Time passed in the way it does when life is full and happy. Eddie grew into a responsible young man. The twins became chattering, energetic girls, and Thomas surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for mathematics and books. Grace and Elijah grew older together, finding new depths to their love with each passing year. On their 10th anniversary, Elijah took Grace back to the spot where they'd first kissed, in the bakery kitchen. May was watching the children, giving them a rare evening alone. 10 years, Elijah marveled, pulling Grace into his arms. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like we've been together forever. Both, Grace said, resting her head against his chest. It feels like both. Do you ever regret it? Elijah asked. Coming west, all the struggles and challenges. Grace thought about the question seriously. There had been hard times, certainly. The exhaustion of new motherhood, the winter when all 4 children got sick with fever and she'd been terrified they'd lose one, the constant challenge of balancing business and family. But through it all, Elijah had been there, steady as the mountains, loving her through every difficulty. Never, she said firmly. Not for a single moment. This life, this family, it's more than I ever dreamed possible. I love you, Grace Stone, Elijah said, kissing her softly. Thank you for saying yes to a cowboy with more hope than sense. Thank you for giving me your savings and asking nothing in return, Grace replied. Thank you for seeing who I could be and helping me become her. They stood there in the empty bakery, holding each other as the sun set beyond the windows, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Outside, San Bernardino went about its evening business, but inside, Grace and Elijah existed in their own world, a world built on trust and kindness and love. When Eddie turned 18, he announced his intention to buy land and start his own ranch. Elijah helped him find a good property not far from their own, and Grace watched her firstborn son sign the deed with tears in her eyes. He was a man now, ready to make his own way. We raised him right, Elijah said, his arm around Grace's waist. We did, Grace agreed. The twins married in a double ceremony when they were 20, marrying brothers from a neighboring ranch. Grace made their wedding cakes herself, using her mother's honey cake recipe, the same recipe that had launched her bakery all those years ago. Watching her daughters laugh and dance at their wedding, Grace felt the circle of life completing itself. Thomas surprised them all by wanting to become a teacher. He moved to Los Angeles to attend a training college, promising to visit often. Grace missed him terribly, but was proud of his ambition, his desire to help others learn. As their children grew and left, Grace and Elijah found themselves alone again, back where they'd started. But they weren't the same people they'd been at 25 and 26. They'd been forged by time and experience into something stronger, their love deepened by shared joys and sorrows. Grace eventually retired from the bakery, selling her share to May, who'd been running it almost single-handedly for years anyway. It felt strange at first, not starting each day with the smell of baking bread, but Grace found new rhythms. She spent her days reading, tending her garden, visiting with her growing brood of grandchildren. Elijah had long since left the Simpson Ranch, working their own land full-time. Eddie helped him now, the two of them running cattle together, expanding the herd gradually. On warm evenings, Grace would watch them ride in together, father and son, and her heart would swell with pride and love. On their 25th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the house for a celebration. Eddie and his wife brought their 3 children. The twins came with their husbands and babies. Thomas brought a young woman he was courting, a schoolteacher like himself. The house was full of noise and laughter, children running everywhere, babies crying, adults talking over each other. Grace stood at the kitchen window, taking it all in, and felt Elijah's arms slide around her from behind. "Overwhelming?" he asked. "Wonderfully so," Grace replied, leaning back against him. "Look at what we built, Elijah. Look at this family, this legacy." "You built it," Elijah said. "With your strength and your love and your amazing honey cakes," Grace laughed. "We built it together. Everything we have, we made together." That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Grace and Elijah sat on the porch, rocking slowly in their chairs. The valley stretched before them, silvered by moonlight, as beautiful as the day Elijah had first shown it to her. "You remember the day we met?" Grace asked. "When those men were robbing me and you rode up like some kind of hero?" "I remember," Elijah said. "I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I'd ever seen, standing up to those thieves even though you were terrified." "I remember thinking you were the kindest man I'd ever met," Grace said. "And then you gave me your money, and I knew you were something special." "Best $100 I ever spent," Elijah said with a grin. "You got it back plus interest," Grace reminded him. "I got so much more than that," Elijah said seriously. "I got you. I got our family. I got a life beyond anything I'd imagined. That $100 bought me everything that matters." Grace reached over to take his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" "The best," Elijah agreed. "And it's not over yet. We've got years ahead of us still, grandchildren to spoil, adventures to have." "Promise me something," Grace said. "Anything. Promise me you'll never regret giving me that money, that you'll never wish you'd kept it, bought land sooner, built your ranch faster." Elijah turned to look at her, his eyes shining in the moonlight. "Grace Elizabeth Stone, I could live 1,000 lifetimes and never regret a single moment of loving you. That money was just money. You're everything. You always have been." They sat together in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. An owl hooted from the oak tree near the house. The night sounds of California surrounded them, familiar and comforting. Grace thought about that scared young woman who'd been robbed on a dusty road 25 years ago. She'd been so alone then, so uncertain of her future. She'd lost her family, lost her money, felt like everything was falling apart. But from that lowest moment had come the greatest blessing of her life, because a cowboy with a good heart had stopped to help a stranger, because he'd given her his savings and asked nothing in return, because he'd seen past the immediate situation to the woman beneath, and he'd chosen to invest in her future. That single act of kindness had changed everything. It had given Grace the chance to build her bakery, to prove herself, to create something lasting. But more than that, it had brought Elijah into her life. And from that meeting had sprung decades of love, a family that stretched across California now, a legacy of kindness and generosity that their children and grandchildren carried forward. "What are you thinking about?" Elijah asked softly. "How everything worthwhile in my life came from one moment of kindness," Grace replied. "Your kindness. You changed my life, Elijah Stone." "You changed mine too," Elijah said. "We changed each other, made each other better. That's what love does, I think. It takes two separate people and makes them into something greater together." They rocked in silence for a while longer. Then Elijah stood and offered Grace his hand. "Come to bed, Mrs. Stone. Tomorrow we can visit Eddie's ranch, see those new calves he was telling us about." Grace took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Together they walked into the house, the home they'd built together, filled with memories and love. In their bedroom, They prepared for sleep with the practiced ease of a couple who'd shared a bed for 25 years. As Grace drifted off, wrapped in Elijah's arms, she thought about how perfect life could be sometimes. Not perfect in the sense of being without challenge or difficulty, but perfect in the sense of being exactly what it should be. She'd lost her first family, but she'd found a second one. She'd been robbed, but that robbery had led her to the greatest treasure. She'd dreamed of opening a bakery, and she'd done it. But the bakery had been just the beginning. The real dream, the one she hadn't even known she had, was this. A man who loved her unconditionally, children who made her proud, grandchildren who filled her days with joy, and a legacy of love that would outlast them all. Years continued to pass, gentle as the turning seasons. Grace and Elijah grew old together with Grace, their hair turning silver, their movements slowing, but their love remaining constant. They celebrated 30 years, then 35, then 40. Each anniversary was marked with family gatherings that grew larger as grandchildren married and great-grandchildren were born. The bakery that Grace had built continued to thrive under May's ownership, and then under May's daughter's ownership after that. It remained a fixture of San Bernardino, and people still talked about Grace Norton Stone, the brave woman who'd come west alone and built something lasting. But Grace's real legacy wasn't the bakery. It was the family she and Elijah had created, built on a foundation of kindness and generosity. Their children had learned from their example, treating others with the same compassion their parents had shown. They raised their own children with love and taught them the value of helping others. Eddie ran one of the most successful ranches in the county and was known for his fairness to his workers and his generosity to those in need. The twins were pillars of their community, always the first to help a neighbor in trouble. Thomas became a beloved teacher and then principal, shaping young minds for decades. When Grace was 72, she fell ill with pneumonia. For a week, she battled the fever while Elijah sat by her bedside, holding her hand, refusing to leave. Their children gathered, called by telegrams, and the house filled once again with family, but Grace rallied, her constitution stronger than the illness. "You can't get rid of me that easily," she told Elijah when the fever finally broke. "Thank God," he said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I'm not ready to say goodbye to you yet, not anywhere close to ready." They were granted more years, precious time that they didn't take for granted. They watched great-grandchildren grow, saw Thomas marry his sweetheart, celebrated Eddie's 50th birthday. Every day was a gift, and they treated it as such. On a warm September evening, just after their 50th anniversary, Grace and Elijah sat on their porch as they had countless times before. Grace was 81 now, Elijah 82. Their bodies were old and tired, but their spirits remained young, their love as fresh as ever. 50 years, Grace marveled. Who would have thought that scared girl and that young cowboy would make it 50 years? "I knew," Elijah said. "From the moment you accepted my money and insisted on making it a loan, I knew you were the stubbornest, most determined woman I'd ever meet. I knew we'd make it." "Stubborn," Grace repeated with mock offense. "I prefer determined." "That's what I said," Elijah teased, and they both laughed, the sound carrying across the valley they'd called home for 5 decades. "You ever think about that day?" Grace asked. "When those men robbed me?" "Sometimes," Elijah admitted. "I think about how easily we might have missed each other. If I'd ridden into town an hour earlier or later, if you'd chosen a different place to camp, if those thieves had picked a different victim. So many small choices that led to us finding each other." "I think we were meant to find each other," Grace said. "I think some things are just meant to be." Elijah squeezed her hand gently. "I'm glad we were meant to be. You've made my life an adventure, Grace Stone, Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." "Loving you has been mine," Grace replied. "You saved me, Elijah, not just from those thieves, but from a life of loneliness and regret. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Elijah corrected gently. They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors one more time. The valley stretched before them, dotted now with houses belonging to their children and grandchildren. The land they'd built on together, the legacy they'd created, the love they'd shared for half a century. As darkness fell and stars began to appear, they went inside together, moving slowly but still hand in hand. In their bedroom, surrounded by photographs of their family, they prepared for sleep. "Elijah," Grace said softly as they lay in bed, "thank you for everything. For seeing me, for believing in me, for loving me all these years." "Thank you for letting a foolish cowboy fall in love with you," Elijah replied. "Thank you for building this beautiful life with me." They fell asleep in each other's arms as they had for 50 years. Grace dreamed of honey cakes and wagon wheels, of dusty roads and new beginnings. She dreamed of a young man with kind eyes offering her hope when she'd lost everything. She dreamed of love, the kind that lasted a lifetime, the kind that built legacies and changed the world. And in the morning, she woke to find Elijah beside her, still holding her hand, still loving her after all these years. Outside, the valley awakened to a new day, and their family went about their lives, carrying forward the lessons of kindness and generosity they'd learned from two people who'd found each other on a dusty California road in 1876. Grace and Elijah lived for several more years, granted the gift of growing very old together. They saw great-great-grandchildren born, saw their family tree spread across California and beyond. When Elijah finally passed at 87, surrounded by family, Grace held his hand and whispered her love one last time. She followed him 6 months later, unable and unwilling to live long without her other half. They were buried side by side in the San Bernardino Cemetery, their headstone simple but meaningful. It read, "Elijah and Grace Stone, together forever, built on kindness, blessed with love." And the story of how they met became family legend passed down through generations. The tale of how a cowboy gave a stranger his savings and asked nothing in return, and how that single act of kindness changed 2 lives forever, creating a legacy of love that would echo through time. Their great-great-grandchildren still visit the old house in the valley, maintained now as a family gathering place. They still tell the story of Grace and Elijah, of the robbery that brought them together, of the kindness that sparked a love story for the ages. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the valley is painted in sunset colors, people say you can still feel the love that filled that house, the kind of love that transcends time, that builds legacies, that reminds us all of the power of simple kindness to change the world.